Meshech Chochma, Parshas Shelach. We'll study some of the insights of Rameir Simcha to the mitzvah of tzitzis. And that's at the end of Parshas Shelach. And if with Mirz Hashem we have time, we'll go back to the beginning of the parsha. So the first piece that we want to look at is in Perek Tes Vav, Pasuk Lamed Ches. Now you'll see that the Dibra Maschil, the Koteret, is in parentheses, if you have that. But what we should do in order to appreciate this presentation of Rameir Simcha is to go back to the Pasuk and specifically to the previous Pasuk. And I'll open up the Chumash here. We're at the end of Parshas Shelach. And we're in Perek Tes Vav. And we're going to look at Pasuk Lamed Zayin. Now, Pasuk Lamed Zayin seems to be, at the face of it, a very innocuous Pasuk, something that repeats itself throughout the Torah. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Lemar. But Rameir Simcha is going to make a big deal about this. And then in Pasuk Lamed Ches, Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem v'yasu lahem tzitzis, etc. And the Meshech Chochma quotes a very strange Sifri. Now, in some of the editions I noticed in the Meshech Chochma, the main part of the Sifri is omitted. But in the edition that I have, which is Rav Kuperman's edition, he has the Sifri in its full presentation, which is very important to appreciate Rameir Simcha. The emphasis in the Sifri is on the phrase Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael chayovim b'tzitzis, v'ein hagoyim chayovim b'tzitzis. Okay, so far so good. I'm not sure what the Havamina of the Sifri was. We have Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. But in any event, Bnei Yisrael v'lo hagoyim. Now the Sifri offers an alternative derivation from Bnei Yisrael, and that is, again, here you might want to add a word to the Sifri. Again, I don't have the chutzpah to do that, but at least for pedagogical purposes, it should say, Yachol, I might think, Prat Legerim, right? Bnei Yisrael means the offspring, the genealogical generations of Bnei Yisrael. The Gerim are not in that category. So Prat Legerim, question mark, should we exclude Gerim? Once you exclude Goyim, because the phrase Bnei Yisrael is a miut, then the phrase Bnei Yisrael should be mamayit even Gerim, because they're not Bnei Yisrael. Amrit, and the answer to that question, to remove such a thought from our mind and guarantee that Gerim are included in the mitzvah of tzitzis, is Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Lemar, going back to the previous pasuk. Now, what does the Sifri see in that pasuk? Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Lemar, and that's going to teach us that Gerim are included in the mitzvah of tzitzis. That's a difficult question to answer. But the Sifri apparently has another Havamina, which is not spelled out in the language of the Sifri, and the Sifri from that very same pasuk, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Lemar, is going to exclude that Havamina. Again, we have to add some words to the Sifri. Yachol, I might think that Yechidim are not obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. Talmud Lomar, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Lemar, L'Rabos Yechidim. And if Yechidim are chayiv in the mitzvah tzitzis, then Gerim are chayiv in the mitzvah tzitzis as well. Pirush. Now, obviously, the Meshech Chochma sees this Sifri as almost, can I call it a closed book? It's very puzzling, very mysterious. First of all, if there's a Havamina by Yechidim, that Yechidim are not chayiv in the mitzvah tzitzis, who are these Yechidim that we would entertain the possibility that they're exempt for the mitzvah tzitzis? And furthermore, if there is such a Havamina, how do you derive that Yechidim are chayiv in the mitzvah tzitzis from the phrase Vayomer Hashem al Moshe? Leimor. So in order to put this Sifri together, it's like, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and you have to put all the pieces together. Rabbi Simcha quotes a Gemara in Tainus. And this Gemara also discusses Yechidim, the concept of Yechidim. Now let's understand a little bit of the background. One of the most important themes of Masechta Tainus is a drought, when there's not enough rain in Eretz Yisrael, and Chachamim will decree a fast day. And there are various dates in the Hebrew calendar, and as the calendar moves forward and it gets really later into the winter, there's no rain, at that point, everybody has to fast. It's going to be a gzera on the entire tzibur. But on an earlier date, for example, the Gemara talks about the date of Yud Zayin Mar Cheshvan, and if there are no rains coming down, then Hischilu HaYechidim Misanim, that they're Yechidim, we might call them in our language Yechidei Skula, that already begin fasting even at that early date. They so to speak anticipate that we are getting into a problem and we have to take the initiative. So the Gemara there in Tainus says, Man Yechidim, and you define this category of Yechidim that begin fasting before the rest of the people. Amar Rav Huna Rabbanan, these are the rabbis, the leaders of the community. They are more pious. They take the initiative. They'll start fasting early. Tana Rabbanan, Rabbi Simcha now quotes the end of the sugya there. Al Yomar Adam Talmud Ani, Any Roy Leos Yachid. A person in his humility will say that, okay, there's a group of Yechidim that have already initiated the fast. I don't fit that profile. I'm not on that level that I can call myself Yechidim. I'm one of the Yechidim. Talmud Ani. I'm not a scholar, I'm a Talmud. Any Roy Leos Yachid. Ella, says the Brisa, Kol Talmidei Chachamim Yechidim. No one should exclude themselves and say, well, I'm not a Talmud Chacham, I'm only a Talmud, and I'm not a Yachid. In this particular context, everyone who studies Torah can consider himself one of the Yechidim, and therefore he can take this initiative and start his fast day as early as Yud Zayin B'Cheshvan. And Ezi Talmud, who is a Talmud that's Yachid, Kol Sharoi Limnoso Parnas Alat Tzibur. A person who could function as a leader in the community. You don't have to be a Bucky and Shas and Poskim. You don't have to be able to sit on the Bezdin of the chief rabbi of Israel. You're someone who could serve as a Parnas Alat Tzibur. Consider yourself from the Yechidim. You should have the concern of the community on your shoulders, and therefore, out of that sense of responsibility and identification with the community, you'll begin your fast at that early date. So Meir Simcha now has a source in Shas that could shed a light on this strange, mysterious Sifri, which refers to Yechidim and offers a Havamina, which is a presentation we can't understand, that Yechidim are not chayav in the midst of tzitzis. Who are these Yechidim? The Sifri does not spell out who these Yechidim are, nor why we would have a Havamina that they're exempt from tzitzis. Meir Simcha says now we could plug into the Sifri a translation of that term Yechidim. Who are these Yechidim? These are the Rabbanon. These are Talmidim and Talmidei Chacham. Why would I think that they're exempt from tzitzis? Do we know that a Talmid Chacham is exempt from any mitzvah? And Rabbi Simcha says yes. There is a mitzvah that Talmidei Chachamim are exempt from under certain circumstances, and we might have applied by analogy from that mitzvah to tzitzis that likewise they're exempt from tzitzis. And the Torah went out of its way to say, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe lemar, to teach me that this is incorrect, and even the Talmidei Chachamim or Yechidim are obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. So now the plot goes thicker. We're going to try to understand in the framework of the Meshech Chochma, what is that single mitzvah that exempts a Talmid Chacham, again, under strict circumstances, and we would, by analogy, apply that to tzitzis. Lazeh Amar, Salkedaita Chamina. What does the Torah add in the presentation of the mitzvah of tzitzis? Lo sasuru achrei levavchem. That the purpose of tzitzis is to counter sasuru achrei levavchem. You might be tempted to violate the Torah. So we give you tzitzis, which will always remind you not to violate the Torah. We're always reminded of the Gemara Menachos that tells the story about a man who traveled great distance to have a relationship with a prostitute, and then when he took off his tzitzis, the tzitzis started beating him over the back, and then he desisted. At the end, he married this woman. It's a whole got it to their Menachos. So if a person is tempted by these low temptations, then he has to wear tzitzis. Lo sasuru achrei levavchem. Imkain, hagdolim b'mayla, those who are on a higher level, they're not subject, they are not threatened by lower base inclinations. If the whole purpose of tzitzis is lo sasur achrei levavchem, that the tzitzis has to remind me that I shouldn't have this relationship with a woman of ill repute, I'm on a higher level than that. I should be part of. And just to jump ahead of ourselves, again, if you have the same print by chance that I have, I'm looking at the middle of Kuf, Nun, Dalid on the left column. He says, Ula bitfilin. Remember, I told you that there is one mitzvah where these Yechidim, under certain circumstances, will be potter, the mitzvah of tefillin, because the Gemara says regarding the mitzvah of tefillin that a osek b'Torah potter mitfillin. And why is that? Because the Torah itself spells out the purpose of tefillin. L'man tiyeh Torah Hashem b'ficha. You don't need tefillin to accomplish that goal of L'man tiyeh Torah Hashem b'ficha. You're constantly learning. You're in the category of Torah Naso. So we see that a Talmid Chacham is exempt from a mitzvah, in this case tefillin, because of his dedication to Torah. By analogy, in the case of tzitzis, where the Torah says, Lo sasu achrei levavchem, you are committed to a life of Torah study. You're a Talmid Chacham, you're one of the Yechidim, you fast already on the 14th, on the 17th of Cheshvan, you would be parted from the mitzvah of tzitzis, just like you're parted from the mitzvah of tefillin. A beautiful analysis of the Sifri except we're missing one major piece of the puzzle. Im Kain, Minayin. How do you know that even Yechidim are chayav in the midst of tzitzis? L'chein Amar, the Afim Heim Gedolim Kim Moshe Rabbeinu v'mayla chayav b'tzitzis. Even someone who is as great as Moshe Rabbeinu is chayav b'tzitzis. V'lachein Ksiv. Now we understand how the Sifri derives this from the pasuk Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemar. Rabbi Simcha has a magical interpretation of Vayomer el, whoever it is in the pasuk, anywhere in Tanakh, lemar. The word Vayomer means miyad, immediately, with an urgency. And it's addressing that person to whom Vayomer is addressing. So Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, what does it mean, Vayomer? It means, Moshe, you are obligated in the midst of tzitzis immediately. And who could be more of the Yechidim than Moshe Rabbeinu? And if Moshe Rabbeinu is chayav in tzitzis, how much more so are the rest of the Yechidim chayav in tzitzis? L'chein kasav Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemar. And this is the shita of Vayomer. There's another word that often appears in the Torah, Vayidaber. Vayidaber means you're the conduit to transmit the mitzvah to the people of Israel, but that's not Vayomer. Vayomer is a very personal relationship between the speaker and the person who's the object of that speech. And Vayomer means, I'm talking to you, Moshe Rabbeinu. Lamar, immediately put on your tzitzis. Shekol makom kosev sheyetzorech lasos tekef. Whenever you find a certain immediacy and urgency in the command and the fulfillment thereof, you will find the word vayomer. And he gives you a number of examples. Like, for example, in the case of Agolos, you will see kach me itam. Well, let's see if we can find this. Perik Zion. Pasuk Hey, let's see if I find this here. Oh, Vayomer Hashem Moshe lemar kach me itam. Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm commanding you immediately, take from them. And these are the agalos in the very next pasuk. Vayikach Moshe agalos. Right, these are the agalos to carry the Mishkan. This was an emergency situation. And Vayomer el Moshe lemar, you Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm talking to you. You know, sometimes you hear a voice. Who's he talking to, right? Vayomer el Moshe means Hashem is talking to Moshe. Or, for example, okay, this we didn't get up to yet. Of Zion, the Parsha Benos Slavchan at the end of Pinchas. Let's see what we find there. Again, this is Revi in Parshas Pinchas. Vayomer Hashem Moshe lemar. The women came forward and they say, our father died, he left no sons. We want a chelik in Eretz Yisrael. Tnu lanu achuza. Vayomer Hashem Moshe lemar, Kain v'nos slovcha dovros. Nason tite lem achulas nakta. Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to immediately present your ruling that the Bnos Slavchad will inherit the land. Kain kan Moshe tzarich lasos tzitzis li'atzmo. Pashut. Pashut, yeah, if you're a Be'er Simcha, maybe it's Pashut, but Ulam, in contrast with Tefillin, we have a Mechilta, and the drasha of the Mechilta is that a Osek b'Torah poter min Tefillin, based on the pasuk Levantia Torah Hashem beficha, and Tefillin is like Torah Hashem beficha. It's like he's learning Torah, he's reading the Torah, but somebody who's constantly involved in the study of Torah is poter from Tefillin. And Rabbi Simcha invokes the Shulchan Aruch and the Bir Agra in Orchaim Siman Lamed Ches. He quotes also a Sifra, Taras Kodim, and a Mechilta Kitisa. Achish Chaptosai Tishmoru. This I like very much. Yeah, I almost ignored it, so I apologize. But this is very beautiful. At the end of this presentation, let's open up to the Parsha of Shabbos in Kitisa. We're now in Shmos Lamed Aleph. Every word in the Torah is so important to Rabbi Simcha. Every word, it's amazing. In the Parsha of Shabbos, Lamed Aleph Yud Gimel. Well, let's go back to Pasuk Yud Beis. That's the punchline. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemar. Not Vayidaber, but Vayomer. Ach, in the next Pasuk, Eshab Sotzai Tishmor. And Ach is always a mute. What's the mute? Pikuach Nefesh. That although there's a great mitzvah, an awesome mitzvah in its significance of Shabbos, but we push aside and we override the Shabbos for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh. And the Gemara says, mitzvah bigdola Yisrael, ube Moshe Avdo, Atzmo. Hashem is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, check it out. If there's someone who's in danger, you yourself, Moshe Rabbeinu, have to get involved in desecrating the Shabbos for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh. L'chein kosev vayomer Hashem el Moshe. So in summary, we have two great, massive chidushim here and accomplishments in this presentation of Meshech. Number one, we have an accomplishment that has an impact throughout all of Tanakh. And it's right here in this paragraph, that according to the Meshech Chochma, whenever it says Vayomer El, whoever it is, Lamar, it means Hashem is addressing that person, that he should be implementing this mandate immediately, taketh. And that's something that has an impact all over Tanakh. And the second great chiddush is, what was the Sifri thinking when it said, Yochel, Yechidim, maybe Yechidim are exempt from tzitzis? What was the Havamina that Yechid, we don't even know who Yechidim are? And that's where Meir Simcha invokes the Gemara in Tainis, that Yechidim are the Talmidei Chachamim, and we might think that in tzitzis, the purpose of the mitzvah is defined by Lo Sasu Achrei Levavchem. These are the Gdolim. They're great. They're above the law. They don't need the mitzvah of tzitzis. Called Mashmalon. The Torah says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu, you immediately have to wear tzitzis. How much more so the other Yechidim? Okay, we're making some very, very good progress. One second, I just want to get myself organized here. Second. Oh. Now we're looking at Pasuk Lamed Tes. I got myself rearranged myself here. Vayolachem letzitzis urisem es kol mitzvos Hashem. And the Gemara in Menachos on Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis offers a variety of explanations for what the pasuk means when it says Uriisem Oso. And what does it mean? Uschartem es kol mitzvos Hashem. How is it that tzitzis accomplishes this goal of uschartem es kol mitzvos Hashem? So first, the Gemara, which Meir Simcha doesn't quote here, he just goes on to the second explanation. But the Gemara says that we should be Makayim the mitzvah of tzitzis together with Shema Yisrael, with the mitzvah of Shema. And that's why Parshas tzitzis is incorporated into the Parshios of Shema. And when you remember by looking at your tzitzis, the mitzvos, you'll be makabel ol malchus shemayim by reciting Kriyat Shema, so that the tzitzis becomes a conduit to remember Kriyat Shema, and Kriyat Shema in turn is kabbalas ol malchus shemayim ol mitzvos. Then the Gemara gives a second explanation. That's what we're going to focus on today. And Re'ei mitzvah zu avur mitzvah acheres hasmuchala v'zeh mitzvahs kilayim. The Torah says that by thinking about the mitzvah of tzitzis, you'll remember another mitzvah in the Torah, which is written contiguous to tzitzis, not here, but in Parshas Ki Teitzei. And there it says, Lo tilba shatneis tzeru pishtin yachdav, gedilim tasel. So Meir Simcha writes Pirush, Kimodi Amru Reish Perik Beis the Beitza, Zachreu, Me'achar Shebola Lashkicho, Kain Gam Pirusho Mishum Shemitzah Tzitzis Bo, Lashkiach Mitzvah Shatnis, Shinases Tzemeru Pishtin, V'lachein Tziva Lazkiro. So Rabbi Meir Simcha suggests that when the Torah says Ureisem Oso, that tzitzis is supposed to remind you of something that you might forget, like the Gemara says in Beitza, that whenever the Torah commands you to remember, it means because it would be a natural tendency to forget. So Zachreu here means there's a natural tendency of forgetting the mitzvah of shatnes. Why? And the answer is because Gedilim Taselacha. And from the Gedilim Taselacha, the smichus to the mitzvah of shatnes, we derived Tzemeru Pishtan, that your beged that you're wearing, which is made of linen, is shatnes. It has tzemer. Where's the tzemer? The tzitzis themselves are tzemer, because cheles has to be made of tzemer. Now, once you have established that I am commanded to add tzitzis of tcheles, which is tzemer, to a beged of pishtan, and the mitzvah of tzitzis will override the Isur Lav of Kilayim, then a person might forget the mitzvah of Kilayim. He's so used to walking around with a beged that's really Kilayim because he's attached tzitzis of tzemer to a beged shel pishtan. And therefore, if there's a situation in which by nature you might have a tendency to forget, the Torah goes out of its way and commands you to remember. And as we said, Rabbi Simcha bases himself on a Gemara in Beitzah. The Gemara says that there's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan of Erev Tavshilin. And the Gemara asks, is there some source in the Torah, like what we call an asmachta, for the takana d'Rabbanan of Erev Tavshilin? And Shmuel says that the source is Zochar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha. So we're talking about a case where Zochar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha, you might have a tendency of forgetting the Shabbos. Why is that so? Let's say Yontif falls out on a Friday, correct? So if Yontif falls out on a Friday, just 1 second, let me just make the cheshbon here. So I'm going to prepare food because the Torah allows me to cook ochel nefesh on Yontif, and tomorrow is going to be Shabbos. And the Torah is saying, remember the Shabbos. How do you remember the Shabbos? By making an Erev Tavshilin. What does an Erev Tavshilin mean? It allows me to prepare food on Yontif for Shabbos. So that's what Shmuel derives from the pasuk Zochar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha. You should remember the Shabbos. Remember the Shabbos, even if it means preparing on Yontif for Shabbos. Normally, it's a weekday. So if it's a weekday on Friday, you'll prepare for Shabbos. But if Friday is Yontif, you're so involved in Yontif, you'll forget about Shabbos. No. The Torah is saying, Zochar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha. Don't forget Shabbos. Remember the Shabbos and prepare for Shabbos. How am I allowed to prepare for Shabbos? It's Yontif. And the answer is by making an Erev Tavshilin. Let's go back to our pasuk, right? So in our pasuk, the Torah writes Uschartem. So the Gemara wants to know there must be some justification, some explanation why the Torah commands us Uschartem. Where is the situation that arises that I might forget about something, some other mitzvah in the Torah? Says Rameir Simcha, the mitzvah of tzitzis might cause a person to forget about the mitzvah, the Isser of Shat. That's what the Torah means by saying Uri'isem oso uzchartem. Don't forget the mitzvah of Shat. Okay. Now let's fast forward to pasuk Mem. And if it helps anybody in my print, it's on page Kuf Nun Vav. The Torah says that what's the purpose of the mitzvah of tzitzis? L'man tizkuru v'asisem es kol mitzvotzai, etc. Now, there's a connection here between the mitzvah of tzitzis and remembering the bulk of the mitzvahs of the Torah, the other Taryah. What's the connection? So the Sifri is very famous. The tcheles is made out of a certain color, dyed blue, which reminds you of the Yam. The Yam reminds you of the Rakia, and the Rakia of the Kisei HaKavod. So when I wear tzitzis, and I add a string of tcheles to every corner of my beged, so wherever I turn, I see them, I remember the sky, I remember the ocean. All of these are entities that follow God's will, and they don't deviate from the will of God. So I should certainly remind myself when I see the tcheles, and I know that the Yam and the firmament, the Shamayim, all gives glory to the Kisei HaKavod, then I too have to remember all the mitzvahs Hashem, all His commandments, and I have to obey them the way the ocean and the sky will obey the will of God. But that doesn't satisfy the Meshech. He wants to come up with his own interpretation. What is the meaning, the significance of tzitzis, and how does it remind us of all the other mitzvahs? Now, this Rameir Simcha is one of the longest in all of his commentary on the Chumash. It goes on and on and on till the end of the Parsha. In my print, it's about 8 pages long. I can't go through 8 pages, even if I had the time, which I certainly don't, and you don't have the time. We'd be until the end of Parshas Korah. But what I would like to do is highlight a few points that Rameir Simcha makes over here, because Rav Kuperman, in his introduction to this piece, he writes, and I quote, "Lefanenu echad mi pirkei hamachshava hanifloim shel Rabbeinu." Pirkei machshava means a philosophical hashkafic enterprise or essay, and he calls it nifla. Obviously, there's layers and layers of meaning in this presentation of the Meshech. But I want to share with you what I was able to get out of it. And I think that perhaps the most important part of this Rameir Simcha is a quote and in a commentary on the Gemara in Chagiga. So again, it's very close to the beginning of Rameir Simcha's presentation. If you happen to have the same print that I have, it's on the second column. The first column is just 2 lines on the right, but if you go to the left, the bottom of the second column, in any other print of Rameir Simcha, will probably be 15 lines or so into the paragraph that keeps going on and on. And he says, Zeu sha'amru, because I think in this quote in the Gemara Chagiga is the key to unlock this entire presentation of Rameir Simcha. Chagiga daf yud beis, my shin daled yud. What is the meaning of this name of Hashem? And in a very, very famous statement which Rashi quotes on Chumash, the Gemara says that it's made up of 2 words. The shin is no trikun for an entire sentence. So you read the shin as sha'omar le'olamo, and then the daled yud is dai. What does this mean? Sha'omar le'olamo dai. Rameir Simcha presents a thesis here about hachano shehechen v'osav v'izmin lo'olamo. He speaks about God creating the world, and he says, Amar lo'olamo dai. I've created boundaries for the world. There's a bria that I created, Bishle Musa, and it's a complete world, and dai. Those boundaries are well defined, and you can't go beyond the boundaries. In fact, Rameir Simcha quotes a statement in Chazal that at some point, the oceans of the world desired to override their bounds, and the water would flow, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu castigated them with the word Shin Daled Yud, Sha'omar Lo'olamo Dai. He rebuked the ocean by saying, die. It should be dry, and the land is separated from the water. You have no right to change nature as I created it and turn dry land into ocean. So it means that stage 1, if we understand the name of God, Shin Dal Yud, is There's a creation. It's well defined. It is made with boundaries. And don't go beyond. He's addressing all of creation, not to go beyond these bounds that were created by Hashem. And that's Hakofa Al. But now we get to a major breakthrough. And Rabbi Simcha writes that now the Torah gives us mitzvos and chooses the nation of Israel. And now what happens is nature, so to speak, changes. What does that mean? Man, and it starts with Avram Avinu. If you'll see a little bit before the paragraph that we read just now, the lines we read, it says in the pasuk, Behi bar am. What is Behi bar am? Gracious ballad, pasuk hey. Let's just see it inside. It's Meir Simcha doesn't quote the whole pasuk. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time looking for psukim today, but it says here. Okay. All right. Zachar unekeva baram vayvarchol sam vayikra shmo adam biyom hi baram. Now, if you look at the word hi baram, which is describing creation, and it's made up of 5 letters, if you just rearrange the letters, you end up with Avraham. So this is a reference to Avraham. And Rameir Simcha says that when the Chazal in the Bereishis Rabbah say that Bi Baram should be read Avraham, it is making a major breakthrough. And it's teaching us a new essential metaphysical fact about man's responsibility, his potential, and the impact that he can have on nature. So when God addresses the natural universe, it's Shin Daled Yud. Omar La'olamo Dai. But when he talks about the Bria, and he refers to Avram Avinu, he's talking about a potential of man to recreate nature. And Rameir Simcha presents the thesis that the Torah says Asher bar Elokim Lassos at the beginning of the Torah. Lassos means he's inviting man to become a partner with him in continuing creation. So with regard to the physical world, it's Omar Lo Lamo Dai. But with regard to the spiritual, metaphysical world, God says, you are a partner with me in creation. And the first paradigm of such a partner in history is Avram. Adam miyasher darko shomer pekudas habore az hateva kli chefetz eitz al hashgacha v'tispashet kochoseo li ein gvul. The phrase ein gvul, which is here being used by Rameir Simcha to describe teva, is the exact opposite. It's the antonym, if you will, of Shin Daled Yud. Shin Daled Yud is all about gvul, die. Don't go beyond your boundaries. That's how God addresses nature. Nature has to obey the will of God expressed in the physics and the boundaries that God created for the universe. But on the other hand, when God addresses man, and specifically the nation of Israel, it's a whole different parsha. Then we describe Teva as Ein Gvul. Why? Because if man brings down the Hashgach of Hashem through man's actions, if man is totally dedicated to serve God and bring about God's will and the reality and the glory of God, then Teva becomes a Kli Chefetz Eitzel Hashgacha. Very fancy Hebrew words here, but I think what he means is that now all of nature becomes like malleable, like silly putty in the hands of God. God is now going to change nature, li'ein gvul. It no longer has its original bounds. There's going to be a wonderful universe, a wonderful world as a result of man's spiritual dedication to the will of God. So that nature now takes on a whole new meaning. It becomes a kli. It's only a condiment. It's only a means to an end. It doesn't have its gvul anymore. But that man, as he develops himself spiritually and reaches heights, he takes the world with him. And the world itself in which man lives can be uplifted to incredible spiritual heights. And that's going to have an impact on the universe itself. And therefore, Rabbi Meir Simcha says that at the beginning of this paragraph, Yodua habori yisbrach v'chochmaso hamisachedes imo, God and his chochma one, bara mitzius re'uyalo, he created a certain reality. He toid al shleimuso v'chachmaso, the world is a manifestation, a testimony to God's infinite perfection and wisdom. Umitziuso, and God's essence and existence and being mechuyeves v'kodemes, it is the existence par excellence of existence. Ulam ha'olam hashafel bara sipuri. Sipuri is a word that comes from medieval philosophy, and it means that ha'olam nivra aval eno b'matzav kavua. It's not static. Elo b'matzav nazil. So sipuri means it could change. It's fluid. Likrat, with a potential for shleimut nosefet, for going on to a higher level of perfection. And who could bring the world to a higher level of perfection? It's someone like Avram, because his actions, his activity is mashlunes habriya, completes the briya, umales ha'olam lipisgot chadashot. It uplifts the world to a higher level. And miles hateva, and it's going to have an impact on nature to the point where it's chutz ligvulas hakvuim shalom. Teva now becomes invested with the power to go beyond its boundaries. Now he quotes a Gemara in Tainus to prove this. And this is a sugya on Daf Chaf Gimel. And the Gemara in Tainus says the following. The Shimon ben Shetach, again, right there after Avram Avinu, if you're following in the text, well, this was all just in the first paragraph of Rabbi Meir Simcha. He says that Shimon ben Shetach, hayu osim kishnei kloyos. If you take a look here in footnote number 6, the Gemara there is darshaning the word be'itom, that God says, I will bring the rains down at certain times. And that's going to be the Lele Revios on Wednesday nights and Lele Shabbosos on Friday nights. The Ein Torach L'Bnei Adam, the Ein Holchim L'Darkon. The Lele Revios Igras bas machlas. Okay, so we have to know more about the sugi. But anyway, people are not traveling on Wednesday nights, certainly not on Friday nights. And that's when the rains would come down so they don't interfere with man and human activity. During the period of Shimon ben Shetach, the rains would only come down on Wednesdays and Fridays. And you would think if there's only 2 nights a week of rain, that's not going to be enough to produce the grains in the field. V'nasu chitim kikloyos. And the chitim was so full and so developed, and they blossomed like the kidneys. They were so large. Says Rav Meir Simcha, what's the point of this Gemara? And that is that someone like Shimon ben Shetach, following in the footsteps of Avram Avinu, is going to be able to partner with God in creation, such that the kernels of wheat will now be as large as kidneys, which the Gemara is using that as a phrase to indicate how beautiful nature will be. And all this is a result of the actions of Shimon ben Shetach. Nature is now just passing all of its boundaries. Now, what this means is that not only is man a partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lassos, in creating the world, it also means that man has to go out there and use every opportunity, every encounter with nature as a potential of penetrating into nature, this spiritual power of faith, of belief in God. If wherever I turn, says Rav Meir Simcha, I see God, then that's going to have an impact on nature itself. My spiritual achievements will facilitate a change in nature. The oz teva kli chefetz etzel hashgacha. V'tis pashet kochosel li ein gvul. K'mo shematzinu in the second parak, Shimon ben Shetach. Now, what does this have to do with tzitzis? So for that, we have to fast forward a couple of pages, because as I say, there's so much here in this presentation of Rav Meir Simcha. But when he gets back to tzitzis, which is almost at the end of this, he says the following. There's a concept called a levush, a garment, or a beged. And the Torah says that you have to put tzitzis on a beged. Says Rav Meir Simcha, there's a tremendously profound message in putting tzitzis al kanfei bigdechem. The levush, the garment, is both in the physical and in the highest spiritual worlds a covering that conceals. Down in this world, you don't want to see myself, right? So I cover myself with garments, sometimes not just to cover my body, but I put on a facade. And that's the concept of levush. It prevents other people from seeing you as you really are. So God created a world that's made of teva. Teva is a levush. Nature serves to conceal the divine creator. It's in a sense a guise, a garment. So Kadosh Baruch Hu says, on the levush, I'm going to give you a mitzvah of tzitzis, al kanfei bigdechem. I'm going to tell you that although nature in and of itself is a levush and it conceals godliness, I'm going to command you, al kanfei bigdechem, the asu lachem tzitzis. I'm going to introduce the human element into the equation. I'm going to make you responsible for an action of putting tzitzis on your begonim. That's going to change the whole nature of a levush. The message here is that we have a concept of a davar shebekdusha. Davar shebekdusha means I can take something physical. Again, I'm combining a lot of different things that are based on, and I can elevate it to something spiritual. And that's what I do when I put tzitzis. The emphasis is on asulachem. This is no longer nature. In nature, we have a garment, we have a levush, we have a guise and a concealment. But man is called upon to get actively involved. Put the tzitzis on your beged, like the actions of an Avram Avinu, of a Shimon ben Shetach. We are called upon lasos to actively become partners with Ribono Shalom. And what do? We reach the Kisei HaKavod. We go beyond the oceans of the world that are bounded, and beyond the Rakia, which is bounded. That's physical nature. Shin Daled Yud. And we go up to the Kisei HaKavod, and we declare through our actions that it's way beyond the Yam, it's way beyond the Rakia, it's the Kisei HaKavod. Hashem sits on the Kisei HaKavod. He rules the entire world. He is in control and sovereign rulership over every aspect of the universe, of our lives. And this is what the Torah says, Uschartem vasisem es kol mitzvosai. Why? Because basically every mitzvah, says Rabbi Simcha, has that identical goal and purpose as tzitzis. Tzitzis becomes the paradigm because we're taking something which is a beged, a levush, and through the asiyah, we're changing its very essence. And we're going up to the Kisei HaKavod and declaring God as the sovereign ruler of the nation. That's our asiyah. But that really is indicative of the asiyah of all the other 612 mitzvahs. And if only we can have that concentration, the problem is, and Rav Cooperman points out in the footnote that at the beginning of Parshas B'chukosai, Rabbi Simcha spends an entire essay addressing this problem of hergel, that we get so used to something. We get used to doing the mitzvahs by routine. And we're very laid back about our mitzvahs. We don't pay attention that our mitzvahs really have the secret power to control nature through the hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God created nature and he orchestrated nature, but he's giving man the ability to control nature, to impact on nature, to make this world a more perfect world through human action by changing the metaphysics, and that's going to have an impact on the physics. And this is what Rameir Simcha calls sfugi, as opposed to sipori. Again, using philosophical terms from a different generation, but what he means to say is that man has within him the potential to change nature. And that's the mitzvah of tzitzis. L'man tizkeru ve'asisem es kol mitzvahs. If you remember Hashem and the Kisei HaKavod through the mitzvah of Tcheles, then you will remember Hashem through all his mitzvahs. L'man tizkeru ve'asisem es kol mitzvosai. Every one of the mitzvahs enables and empowers man with the potential for spiritual elevation by declaring Hashem throughout the entire universe and having an impact and a change on nature itself. So these are the three pieces that we studied today on tzitzis. I was hoping that we'd have more time to go back to the beginning of the parsha and speak about the Meraglim a little bit, but ain't davar. And let's just review very, very quickly and summarize the highlights of these three pieces on tzitzis. Number one, the question was the Sifri with a very strange Havamina that Yechidei Skula would not be obligated in tzitzis. Who are these Yechidim? We saw the Gemara in Tainus on Daf Yud, And these Yechidim who might be potter from Tefillin, we might think they're potter from tzitzis, but Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemar, immediately Moshe, I'm addressing you. You are chayiv in tzitzis, and if you're chayiv in tzitzis, who could be a greater yachid than you are? Kal v'chomer all the others. The second discussion that we had is about the concept of tzitzis reminding us not to forget about some other mitzvah. And the Gemara singles out the mitzvah of shatnez. And why would we be tempted to forget shatnez? Because Gedilin Tasalecha overrides the mitzvah of shatnez. And finally, the discussion about how tzitzis operates to remind us of all the mitzvahs. How does tzitzis connect us with all the mitzvahs? Tzitzis is a mind-boggling breakthrough, a revolution about man and his impact on the world of Shin Daled Yud, how man can take this world to a higher level. And if we get that message in tzitzis, then we could apply that message to all of our avodas Hashem, to all Taryag. I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone a great Shabbos Parshas.
Sure.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.